I knew something was off the second his assistant called me in without eye contact. You don't spend 10 straight months living on black coffee, conference calls that stretch past midnight, and redrafting merger terms until your vision blurs just to be summoned like a temp who misfiled a spreadsheet. But there I was, standing outside Reed Whitmore's glass-walled office less than 24 hours after closing the biggest deal in the company's history. My own name still attached to 3,000 pages of legal scaffolding that kept $5 billion from collapsing like a house of cards. He barely looked up from his espresso machine. Yes, he had one in his office, chrome gleaming, grinding away like the sound of my career being mulched. Without preamble, without a nod to the months of work, he said, "We're going in a different direction." Just like that, like changing toothpaste brands. I stood there waiting for the punchline. None came. He leaned back in his chair, too young, too smug, wearing a suit his tailor probably steamed that morning while he brushed his teeth. Reed Whitmore, the family's golden boy. Or more accurately, the family's spoiled cleanup act. You know the type, born on third base and swears he hit a triple. His uncle dies, his father panics, and suddenly Reed parachutes in to reimagine a company he barely understands. I'd been up for 72 hours straight the week prior, stitching together cross-border tax clauses, customs exemptions, and enough arbitration safeguards to keep an army of lawyers busy until retirement. And this kid, who probably couldn't spell indemnification, was sipping espresso while firing the only person who knew where the legal tripwires were buried. I didn't shout, didn't protest, didn't give him the satisfaction of tears or bargaining. I just listened as he explained the company needed a more aggressive legal strategy, whatever that meant. It was buzzword soup, the kind consultants peddle at $5,000 an hour. His tone was casual, like he was dismissing a caterer, not the architect of a $5 billion merger. I placed my badge on his desk, the weight of 12 years of loyalty condensed into a flimsy rectangle of plastic, and turned without looking back. If he noticed the tiny smile tugging at my lips, he probably chalked it up to shock. He couldn't have imagined it was relief. Because here's the part no one ever sees coming. When someone like Reed thinks they're cutting you out of the picture, sometimes the picture itself changes. I didn't need to yell, didn't need to threaten. My revenge wasn't loud. It was written, and it was already signed by every board member, every international counterpart, every compliance officer who thought they were just initialing a boring appendix. And hey, before I go any further, let me just sneak this in. If you're sitting there listening, probably on your commute or while pretending to work, hit that subscribe button and tap like. 99 out of 100 people won't, but it keeps stories like this alive. Keeps the coffee flowing and the late nights worth it. All right, back to Reed and his espresso-fueled arrogance. As I walked out of that office, I felt every pair of eyes in the hallway follow me. Some looked shocked, others relieved it wasn't their turn, but most were confused. Nobody knew what had happened yet. All they saw was the woman who just engineered the largest merger in company history leaving without her badge. Reed wasted no time. Within the hour, a mass email went out. Susan's departure had been a planned transition as part of strategic leadership realignment. He made himself the face of the deal, parading as the visionary who carried it across the finish line. Legal and finance scrambled to reorient themselves around his ego. But here's the thing about carefully drafted contracts. They don't care about press releases or arrogance. They care about ink, signatures, and the sequence of events that follow. And as I walked into the elevator, purse slung over my shoulder, the first of those events had already been set in motion. A secure alert pinged my phone. It was from an offshore asset monitor, one I had tied into the contract's automated safeguards. The flag had tripped. Something, or more accurately someone, had just triggered the fuse I left behind. I didn't need to rush. I didn't need to turn back. Reed thought he'd ended my story. What he didn't realize was that I had written the ending long before he ever brewed his first office espresso. Reed wasted no time rewriting the narrative. By the time I'd finished my first decent night's sleep in weeks, his name was already plastered across the company intranet as the architect of the $5 billion merger. My own 12 years of work had been reduced to a single bullet point about a planned leadership transition. He positioned me as some relic gracefully stepping aside so his fresh vision could carry the torch. It was almost impressive, the way he spun it, like I'd been begging for early retirement instead of being fired with all the grace of a canceled lunch order. His tone in the announcement was smugly corporate, dripping with phrases like alignment with strategic priorities and next-generation leadership, the kind of word salad you hear when someone's about to tank morale and pretend it's progress. Legal and finance teams scrambled in the aftermath. You could almost hear the collective panic in their emails, requests for clarifications, desperate attempts to understand how the merger's labyrinthine terms fit with Reed's sudden power shuffle. But Reed didn't bother with details. He strutted through meetings like a prince who inherited a kingdom and assumed the taxes paid themselves. He thought he could muscle his way through the aftermath of a deal that had taken nearly a year to negotiate. It would have been funny if it wasn't so pathetic. From my small apartment overlooking the river, I watched it all unfold like a detached spectator at a play I'd already seen. News alerts trickled in. Press releases glorified him. Some colleagues sent me awkward texts. "I can't believe it. You deserved better. He's a fool." I didn't reply. What could I say? That the fool had already pulled the trigger on something he didn't even know existed? That by the time he finished his victory lap, he'd be standing in the middle of a crater? No, better to let silence do the work. Silence and the contract I'd buried him with. Because the truth was simple. Contracts are like blueprints. Everyone else just sees walls and paint colors, but the architect knows where the load-bearing beams are. I drafted every page of that 3,000-page monster, and inside it were structural safeguards no one else understood. Safeguards designed to protect the company against reckless hands. And Reed's hands were shaking the moment they touched the controls. I remember the exact moment my phone buzzed. A secure alert from an offshore asset monitor I hadn't looked at in months. It was discreet, no sirens, no flashing lights. Just a single notification that a contingency flag had tripped. I sipped my tea, looked at the screen, and smiled. The system was working exactly as I designed it. Reed's announcement had barely settled before he tried to make his first move. Shuffling assets, shifting control, testing the edges of what he thought was his new empire. But in doing so, he'd brushed against the wire. One touch and the countdown began. 72 hours until the firewall sealed. 72 hours until his family's $300 million trust was locked in a legal coffin. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the city lights flickering across the water. Everyone thought I was licking my wounds, nursing humiliation. But humiliation only lasts if you let it. I wasn't humiliated. I was calm, detached, almost clinical, because unlike Reed, I knew what story was actually being told. And it wasn't his. It was mine. Reed treated the company like a sandbox he'd just been handed on his birthday. Barely 48 hours into his reign, he was already tossing sand out of the box, reshaping castles, and pretending he invented shovels. His first bold move? Asset optimization. That's how he phrased it in the memo to the board. What it really meant was funneling $300 million of his family's trust money into an offshore fund with his own name etched across it like a neon sign. Cayman shell, slick paperwork, no subtlety. It was the kind of maneuver that screams, "I've watched too many YouTube videos on wealth management." He thought he was playing four-dimensional chess, when in reality he was setting fire to the rulebook I had already written. The merger contract wasn't just a stack of legal jargon. It was a living thing. Buried in those 3,000 pages were compliance systems most people would have skimmed right past. Reed was one of those people. He signed what I handed him during negotiations without a second glance. Too busy with his golf swing and curated Instagram persona to bother reading the fine print. He called the appendices clutter. Asked if I could make it digestible. I did on the surface. Underneath, the real protections hummed like buried landmines waiting for a careless footstep. So when his family office hit submit on that transfer request, the system I'd built quietly blinked awake. No alarms, no press releases, no fiery confrontation. Just a silent tripwire. A flag logged in 3 separate jurisdictions, validated against international compliance codes, and confirmed by timestamp. And with that, Schedule F was alive. Schedule F wasn't flashy. It wasn't designed for drama. It was a contingency clause, a quiet safeguard tucked between cross-border tax harmonization and arbitration escalation procedures. What it said, in essence, was simple. If anyone with a disclosable financial conflict of interest tried to claim controlling ownership within 72 hours of merger closure, the foreign assets would lock themselves down tighter than a vault. Transfers denied. Access frozen. No appeals without consent of the author of record. And guess who that author was? Sitting in my apartment, I saw the secure alert pulse on my phone again. Flag confirmed. Countdown initiated. 72 hours until the lock became permanent. It was like watching a fuse burn. Not fast enough for panic, not slow enough for escape. Reed had struck the match himself. I leaned back, tea warm in my hands, and allowed myself the smallest of smiles. It had begun. Everything he thought he controlled was already slipping through his fingers. And the best part? He didn't even know it yet. The king had crowned himself, but the game was one I'd designed years ago. And this time, the rules weren't his to bend. Reed probably thought it was going to be the easiest victory lap of his career. Wake up, skim the headlines, see his name basking in the glow of visionary leadership. Then take a call from the family office confirming their little offshore play had gone off without a hitch. Instead, he was roused by a phone call that didn't sound like triumph. It sounded like panic. The voice on the other end wasn't congratulatory. It was frantic, clipped, almost wheezing. The $300 million transfer had been denied. Not delayed, not pending. Denied. Worse, when they tried to refresh the accounts, everything showed as locked. Now, you have to understand how these family offices think. Money isn't just currency, it's oxygen. When they can't move it, when they can't massage it into whatever shape they like, they suffocate. And Reed, who had swaggered into his CEO role with all the subtlety of a frat boy crashing a shareholder meeting, suddenly found himself gasping. He barked orders at his staff, demanded explanations, swore there must be a clerical error. Offshore wires don't just stop. Not for him, not for a Whitmore. But the lock wasn't a glitch. It was by design, by mine. By mid-morning, legal was dragged into the mess. The in-house team scrambled through documents, searching for any clause that might explain why hundreds of millions had frozen overnight. But these were lawyers who lived on tidy summaries and boilerplate contracts. The real architecture of the merger, those 3,000 pages, wasn't their turf. They didn't understand what they were looking for. Only that panic had a deadline and Reed's temper was boiling. He stormed into their offices, slamming doors, demanding answers. Someone suggested calling the European Partners Council. Someone else suggested it was a banking issue. One junior associate muttered something about schedule something, but was quickly drowned out by the chaos. Hours bled away, calls stacked up, and the panic grew teeth. Finally, buried in the shared drive, they found it. A single file with a nondescript name, Schedule F. It had sat there all along, invisible to the untrained eye, catalogued neatly in the appendices Reed had once called clutter. They double-clicked. Password prompt. The panic shifted from confusion to dread. Who had access? Who wrote this? Metadata told the story. Author Susan M. Clark. Every timestamp confirmed it. Every revision tracked back to me. I imagine the silence in that room stretched like a rubber band about to snap. The kid who'd fired me 48 hours earlier was now staring at a digital lock with my name engraved across it. He probably didn't even understand what he was looking at. 3 words: schedule. F. Author. Clark. He had cut me out of the company, yet here I was, embedded like a ghost in the very foundation he thought he owned. He called again, louder this time, demanding that someone, anyone, unlock it. Legal shook their heads. The file wasn't just password protected. It was encrypted, mirrored, validated internationally. Tamper-proof, bulletproof, the kind of thing you can't bluff your way around, no matter how expensive your suit or how strong your espresso. That was the moment Reed's swagger cracked, if only for a second. The transfer had failed. The money was locked. And staring back at him from a glowing computer screen was the proof that the woman he'd dismissed as expendable had never really left the building. My fingerprints were everywhere. and the clock on the 72-hour countdown was already ticking louder than his own heartbeat. Reed didn't sleep that night, though he'd never admit it. He stormed back into the office at dawn with his tie askew, jaw set in that performative determination men like him wear when they think sheer willpower can outmuscle legal reality. His first order of business: override the clause. He dragged internal counsel into an emergency session, barking orders like he was directing air traffic. Delete it, circumvent it, rewrite it. I don't care how, just unwind the damn thing. But Schedule F wasn't a loose thread you could just tug out of the fabric. It was mirrored across multiple jurisdictions, validated by outside counsel, and locked down with cryptographic timestamps. Every attempted workaround was like throwing paper at a vault door. The lawyers tried. God, did they try? One suggested filing an emergency motion. Another whispered something about challenging authorship. Reed latched onto each idea like a drowning man grabbing driftwood, then cursed them when each sank under the weight of reality. The more they dug, the clearer it became. The clause wasn't just legally binding, it was practically indestructible. And every attempt to sidestep it only highlighted what they'd missed: that the man who signed off on it was sitting in that very room, face growing redder by the minute. That's when someone finally said it out loud. "Mr. Whitmore, your initials are on every page. You approved this." The CFO, a man who'd spent his career mastering the art of calm neutrality, dropped the mask for a moment. He leaned back, pinched the bridge of his nose, and sighed. "You signed the whole document, Reed. You didn't read it." The words hung there like smoke after a gunshot. Reed tried to laugh it off, some brittle chuckle that fooled no one. "Nobody reads 3,000 pages of legal crap," he snapped, but his eyes betrayed him. He was rattled. Still, arrogance is a stubborn parasite. He convinced himself he could bluff his way out. He'd call the European partner, charm their counsel, flex his title and family name until someone caved. That was the plan. Swagger as a solution. The call didn't go how he imagined. On the other end, the European counsel was cool, precise, their English crisp as glass. "We cannot reverse without consent from the author of record," they said flatly. "Clause is clear. Clause is final." Reed stammered, shifted in his seat, then tried to turn up the pressure. "I'm the CEO. I can authorize a reversal." Silence answered him, long and heavy, before the counsel spoke again. "CEO or not, your authority does not extend to clauses designed to protect against your own conflict of interest. Only the author can release Schedule F." That was the dagger. Only the author. Only Susan Clark. The woman he had fired 2 days ago. The woman he had tried to erase with a mass email and a smug press release. The woman whose name was now stitched into the foundation of his crumbling empire. Inside, panic had already taken root, though he cloaked it in denial. He paced the conference room, jaw tight, voice sharp, insisting there had to be another way. He told himself he still held the upper hand, that the board would rally, that Susan was just a footnote he could erase again. But in the hollow silence after the International Council hung up, even he must have felt the truth. The game had slipped from his hands, and the clock was still ticking. The emergency call was scheduled for first thing in the morning, though in truth it wasn't a meeting so much as an interrogation. Reed sat at the head of the long conference table, face pale but posture rigid, performing the role of the confident leader for the benefit of the dozen nervous executives scattered around him. The CFO sat 2 chairs down, his knuckles white as he fiddled with a pen. Legal had laptops open, notes spread across the table like flimsy shields. The call tone chimed, the screen lit up, and there they were. The European counterpart's legal team, their general counsel front and center, expressionless. The first few pleasantries died almost immediately. The general counsel didn't waste time with small talk, didn't acknowledge Reed's practiced smile. Instead, with all the warmth of a guillotine blade, she asked the question that sliced through the room. "Why did you terminate the individual listed under Clause 22.9 as author of record?" Silence. You could have heard the HVAC hum. Reed's confident mask slipped. He opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "We made a strategic leadership change," he said finally, his words wobbling under the weight of their own emptiness. The general counsel didn't blink. You fired the author of the controlling clause. Why? He stammered, muttered something about restructuring, vision, alignment. The CFO looked down at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. Everyone in the room understood what Reed didn't want to say, that he had fired the only person who could unlock the very clause now choking his $300 million play. The general counsel's tone didn't change. Clause 22.9 stipulates that only the author of record may grant consent for alteration, reversal, or nullification of Schedule F. By terminating that individual, you have removed your company's sole avenue of recourse. The clause is not negotiable. It is legal concrete. Legal concrete. The words landed like cement poured over a coffin. Reed tried to rally. He leaned forward, his voice sharp. I'm the CEO. I have authority to... He stopped when the general counsel raised a single eyebrow. Your authority is irrelevant. The contract is binding. The lock will remain in place until the author of record consents. Or, failing that, until the 72-hour period elapses. At which point the freeze becomes permanent. The CFO's face drained of color. He'd been through mergers before. He knew what permanent meant in this context. Years of litigation, frozen capital, board revolts, angry shareholders, ruined reputations. The very empire Reed thought he was inheriting was about to suffocate under the weight of one clause and one decision he couldn't undo. In that moment, dread filled the room like smoke. It wasn't panic. Not yet. But a heavy, sinking dread that wrapped itself around every executive's throat. They had all been tethered to Reed's arrogance, and now they saw the noose tightening. And at the head of the table, Reed Whitmore sat in silence, his espresso-cured bravado crumbling into something far less regal. He had fired the keyholder, and the lock was already sealing shut. The board ordered an internal compliance review before the call with Europe had even ended. By then, panic wasn't just simmering. It was boiling over into a frenzy of desperate motion. Reed barked at his staff to dig through every draft, every appendix, every footnote. Compliance officers who had never looked beyond executive summaries suddenly found themselves staring into a labyrinth of clauses, metadata, and encrypted files. The deeper they dug, the uglier the picture became. It started with the authorship log. Every version of the merger contract, every revision, every note in the system bore my name. Not as a co-editor. Not as one of many contributors. Sole author. It was like I had carved my initials into bedrock. The compliance team flagged this immediately, sending nervous emails up the chain. Reed skimmed them, then pretended not to understand. But the truth was too stark to dodge. The contract wasn't just something I worked on, it was something I had engineered. Every bolt, every beam, every hidden trapdoor. Then came the keys. Buried in the metadata were references to encrypted control codes. Not stored locally. Not in the company's archives. They had been lodged with an international legal firm, time-stamped, notarized, validated across jurisdictions. It was redundancy layered over redundancy, the kind of thing only someone who had lived through mergers gone wrong would think to build. Even if Reed had the raw files, even if he somehow cracked the password, the actual authority to lift Schedule F didn't sit on his servers. It sat in vaults scattered across borders, where his name carried no weight and his title meant nothing. And then there were the emails. Someone in compliance unearthed a chain from 6 months back, during the height of negotiations. Reed had written, "Can you condense the final doc? Exec team doesn't have time to sift through clutter." He'd asked me to trim the fat, simplify the summaries, and move extraneous materials into appendices. I had nodded, polite as ever, and done exactly that. What he didn't realize then, and what was damning now, was that Schedule F was nestled inside those very appendices he never read. He had literally asked me to bury the clause deeper, making it invisible to executives too impatient for details. The compliance review ended with a blunt summary. Schedule F is binding. The lock is active. The countdown is irreversible without the consent of the author of record. The room went silent when that last line was read aloud. Reed paced, muttering, demanding alternatives, but every pair of eyes in the room knew what it meant. Only Susan Clark could release the lock. Only the woman he had dismissed like yesterday's intern could undo the clause now choking his empire. And outside his office walls, the hours kept slipping away. The countdown ticked on, quiet, patient, merciless. The board insisted on one last attempt before the 72 hours ran out. Phones buzzed, assistants whispered, and within an hour an international call had been arranged. Reed sat at the head of the conference table again, flanked by the CFO, legal, and half the directors, his nerves camouflaged behind a stiff collar and clenched jaw. On the big screen, the dial tone rang, then clicked. The image that filled the monitor wasn't some shadowy law office or an austere courtroom. It was me, sitting at a small table in a cafe in Zurich, sunlight spilling across the cobblestones behind me, a porcelain teacup in hand. "Hello, Reed," I said, my voice light, conversational, as if this were any other morning. "I hear you've been busy." For a heartbeat, he didn't speak. His face contorted between fury and disbelief, like he couldn't decide whether to roar or beg. Finally, he chose bravado. "Susan, we need to resolve this. Schedule F, whatever you buried in there, it's obstructing critical transfers. Undo it, and I'll ensure the company compensates you generously." His voice cracked on generously, betraying the panic he thought he'd hidden. I smiled faintly, almost amused. "Compensation isn't necessary. What's in place is in place. The clause can't be altered post-execution unless all parties mutually agree. That's not my rule. That's the law you signed into existence." The CFO cleared his throat, tried to play diplomat. "Susan, surely you understand the implications. The trust, the assets, this could destabilize." "Then perhaps," I interrupted softly, "the assets should have been reviewed more carefully before attempting to move them. Schedule F is explicit. Conflict of interest triggers a freeze. It's not personal. It's procedural." The words landed with the weight of a gavel. No anger, no vengeance, just cold, clean fact. Reed tried again, flailing now, his words spilling over each other. "We can renegotiate terms, make adjustments, bring you back in." "Reed," I said, still calm, still sipping tea. "You don't renegotiate a fire alarm while the building burns. You signed this. You chose not to read it. And now the safeguards are doing exactly what they were designed to do." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. No one around that table dared to speak. They all knew the truth, though only Reed was stubborn enough to fight it. There was nothing to bargain with, nothing to threaten me with. My work had already been validated, mirrored, enforced. Even if I wanted to undo it, and I didn't, the mechanism no longer belonged to anyone in that room. I set the cup down, leaned slightly closer to the camera. My tone never changed. My expression never wavered. "This isn't personal. It's procedural." Then I ended the call. The screen went black, and in that darkness, all Reed had left was the ticking of a clock he could no longer stop. The 72-hour countdown ended with no fanfare, no alarm bells, no fireworks. It was quieter than that, colder than that. At precisely the moment the clock ran out, the legal firewall sealed itself, the system confirming what had been inevitable from the instant Reed moved that money. The Whitmore family trust was frozen. $300 million, locked under international conflict clauses, pending a multi-year review process that no one, not even the Whitmores with all their lawyers and political donations, could rush. It wasn't gone, but it was as good as gone. Tied up in red tape, inaccessible, suffocating under the weight of due process. The family office called Reed first, then his uncle, then his father. The calls stacked one after another, everyone angrier, more desperate than the last. His phone buzzed on the table like an insect trapped under glass. He didn't answer. He couldn't. What could he say? That he'd fired the only person who understood the system? That he'd signed a contract without reading it? That his arrogance had detonated a clause designed to protect against people exactly like him? The board of directors didn't need long. They convened an emergency session that afternoon. It wasn't emotional. It was transactional. Reed had failed in less than a week, and the financial loss was catastrophic. The vote of no confidence wasn't shouted or dramatic. It was measured, swift, surgical. His removal was not a punishment, it was a formality. By the time the vote concluded, his authority was gone. His badge still hung from his belt, but it may as well have been a souvenir. He stayed in the boardroom long after the others left, staring at the empty chairs, the scattered papers, the black screen at the far end of the table. The phone kept buzzing with angry relatives, each vibration a reminder of the empire he just choked to death with his own hands. And then, as if the building itself wanted to drive the knife deeper, the overhead speaker clicked on. Not live, a recording. My voice, steady, calm, precise. The same tone I'd used months earlier on the original contract call, laying out the provisions he had chosen not to read. "If you're going to cut out the architect," the voice said, echoing across the hollow room, "don't be surprised when the ceiling caves in." Reed didn't move, didn't shout, didn't cry. He just sat there, the phone buzzing in front of him, the silence pressing in on all sides. The king of nothing, sitting under the rubble of his own making. And across the ocean, in a quiet Zurich cafe, I sipped my tea, folded the newspaper, and smiled. The game had ended exactly the way I wrote it, with precision, not noise. A scalpel to a necktie, clean, final, irreversible.